I know hindsight is 2020. Do you think the amount of life lost on both sides achieved anything, and could it have been avoided, in your opinion?
Oh yeah, I believe absolutely it could have been avoided if the British government had not have looked away for decades after Ireland was partitioned, and had have recognised that the Catholic nationalist community, the pro-Irish community in the north, were being treated as second and third class citizens in their own country, being heavily discriminated against, dominated, and felt absolutely worthless within their own country. Yes, it could have been avoided, but the civil rights protests began. I was 18 years of age when the civil rights protests began. There was conflict in Ireland long before I was born, hundreds of years before I was born, and in the decades before I was born. And of course, I came from a city that was overwhelmingly nationalist, but which was ruled by unionist, pro-British politicians in a city that was effectively gerrymandered. And when people marched on the streets, people were beaten off the streets, and eventually they were shot off the streets. The first shots fired in Derry were fired by the British Army and by the RUC. People that I know were killed by the British Army, and of course, several of my neighbours were shot dead on Bloody Sunday. Now, some people made a choice that they would join the SDLP, John Hume's party. Other people like me felt we had no choice but to fight back. Our city was occupied by thousands of British soldiers. Nothing was being done to change political circumstances. And I would have felt ashamed if I hadn't been part of the struggle against what the British were trying to do. I was asked this question about the other day in RTE and television in Dublin. Was it worth it? There is absolutely nothing glorious or joyous about war. It's absolutely horrible. It's terrible. And it's only when you live through it and you see the suffering, not just of your own people, but the suffering that others had inflicted on them, whether it be suffering within the police. Young British soldiers lost their lives in the north. I know they had families in England. Some of these guys probably didn't even realise where they were or what the political circumstances that had them in places like Derry and Belfast and South Armagh. And of course, many IRA volunteers, many of whom I know, lost their lives. Some of them were murdered, shot down in the streets by the British Army. A young man, Colin Keaton, who was particularly a close friend of mine, almost like a brother, was shot to death along with Eugene McGillan. Weren't involved in any armed activity whatsoever, but a regiment of the Blues and Royals come into the bogside one night and shot both of them dead. No, it's absolutely terrible. But is it worth it? How can you say it's worth it? The reality is that we've had a conflict. We've ended the conflict. People will say on the British side, well, the only reason it ended was because the IRA bombed their way to the negotiating table, and the British had to concede different aspects in the negotiations. Well, people can have their own view of what happened. The reality is that a sensible group of people, led on our side by Gerry Adams, on the British side by Tony Blair, by people like John Hume, Father Alec Reid, and of course Bill Clinton was a major contributor to our peace process. The Taoiseach at the time in Dublin was Albert Reynolds, later to be followed by Bertie Ahern. People made enormous contributions to bringing about an inclusive negotiating process. And finally, with the massive assistance of Senator George Mitchell, and nobody in this room should underestimate the contribution that the United States of America and political leaders in the United States of America and Irish America, many of whom are in this room with you tonight, made to the building of this peace process. An absolutely enormous contribution, not just by Bill Clinton, but by President Bush, and now by President Obama. Hillary Clinton has been a star. So we will forever be grateful and be indebted to the United States of America, the White House, the Congress, people like Jim Walsh, who I'll be seeing, former Congressman Walsh in Syracuse tomorrow, people like Richie Neal, from across the House, Republican Party, Democratic Party, came together to support our peace process. So that's an enormous contribution. But how can you say that the loss of over 3,000 lives is worth anything? The fact is that it is a reality. It did happen. It was terrible. It was awful. Our job as politicians is to make sure it never, ever happens again.